There is a map in Istanbul. It was drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, made on gazelle skin, roughly 3 feet wide. It shows the Atlantic Ocean, the western coasts of Europe and Africa on the right side, the eastern coast of the Americas on the left. Columbus had reached the Caribbean only 21 years earlier. The map's depiction of the American coastline is imperfect in places, uncertain in others, assembled from sources that Piri Reis himself listed in notes, written directly in the margins. He was meticulous about this. He wanted whoever read the map to understand where the information came from. For 400 years, the map was largely forgotten. Then, in 1929, it was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace during a renovation. It eventually made its way to historians and cartographers who began examining it carefully, and they noticed something in the lower portion that nobody had expected. There is a coastline at the bottom. It runs along the southern edge of the map, east to west, with bays and inlets and what appear to be mountain ranges indicated in careful detail. Positioned where it is, relative to the latitudes established by the rest of the map, that southern coastline appears to correspond to the coast of Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The map was drawn 307 years before that. I've spent a fair amount of time trying to find a clean explanation for this. I haven't entirely found one. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that goes wrong quickly. The popular version of the Piri Reis story is seductive. It runs like this. The map shows Antarctica with such precision that it could only have been copied from a source, made by an advanced civilization, before the ice, thousands of years ago, when the continent was still exposed, when its coastline was accessible and could be surveyed. The argument has been made repeatedly, most visibly by Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and more recently by Graham Hancock in various forms. Not because the map isn't interesting, it clearly is, but because the argument requires more than the evidence supports. In several places, it requires actively ignoring what the evidence doesn't support. There is a difference between a question worth taking seriously and a conclusion worth accepting. In this case, the distance between those two things is considerable. The question is worth taking seriously. That part I'm more confident about. Piri Reis was a serious man doing serious work. He was not a mystic or a speculator. He was an Ottoman naval commander with a professional interest in accurate geography, and his map was a working document, a practical tool, not a philosophical statement. His marginal notes describe his sources with specificity, approximately 20 existing charts, including what he described as a map drawn by Columbus himself, several Portuguese charts of the southern Atlantic, and a number of older Arab and Greek sources that he synthesized into a single composite image. He was explicit that he was compiling and combining rather than observing directly. This matters. Piri Reis was not claiming personal discovery of the southern coastline. He was drawing from something. The question is what? Charles Hapgood's argument, which is the foundation of most subsequent versions of this story, rested on an analysis of the map's projection system. He claimed the map used a sophisticated spherical projection, centered on a specific geographic point, and that when you applied this projection correctly, the southern coastline aligned with the subglacial topography of Antarctica. Not the ice surface we see today, the actual bedrock beneath it. The true shape of the continent, hidden under kilometers of ice. That is a striking claim. Several professional cartographers and historians have reviewed Hapgood's analysis and found it wanting. The projection argument requires a number of assumptions about where he chose to anchor his coordinate system, and critics have demonstrated that small changes in those assumptions produce very different results. The precision Hapgood claimed to find may be, at least in part, a product of the interpretive choices built into his methodology, rather than a property of the map itself. This is important to say clearly. The geographic match between the Piri Reis southern coastline and Antarctica is disputed by people who have looked at the technical details more carefully than most of us can. Hapgood thought the correspondence was striking. Professional cartographers who reviewed the same analysis are significantly less convinced. That doesn't mean Hapgood was wrong about everything. It means his central argument is weaker than the popular version of this story presents it. What is not disputed is that the coastline is there. Something is drawn at the bottom of the map. The question is what Piri Reis thought he was drawing, and where the information came from. The most common mainstream explanation is that he was drawing a speculative southern continent. This was standard practice in European and earlier Greek geographical theory. The idea, called terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land, appears in geographical writing as early as Aristotle and persisted through the entire Renaissance period. The reasoning was theoretical. A large northern landmass must be balanced by a comparable southern one, or the world would be, in some sense, lopsided. Many maps of the period include a large southern continent drawn not from observation but from this assumption. This explanation is plausible. It is probably correct, at least in part. The difficulty is in the details. Typical Terra Australis depictions tend to show a vague, undifferentiated mass, a suggestion of a continent rather than a description of one, shapeless, approximate. The Piri Reis southern coastline is more specific than that. It has bays. It has what appear to be river systems indicated. It has a profile that, even setting aside Hapgood's contested projection analysis, does not look like pure imagination given form. Whether that detail represents real geographic information, transmitted through some chain of sources, we cannot now reconstruct when we're simply a more artistically elaborate form of the same. Speculation that produced other Terra Australis depictions. I cannot say with confidence. The historians who have looked at this most carefully seem to be similarly uncertain. That detail stayed with me. The map sits uncomfortably between the two possibilities. The Piri Reis map does not stand alone. This is the part of the story I find most difficult to set aside cleanly, and I want to describe it carefully. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531, drawn just 18 years after, Piri Reis, also shows a large southern continent. But this version includes what appear to be river systems running from interior highlands toward the coast. Rivers require liquid water. Liquid water requires ice-free conditions. The positions of those apparent rivers correspond, in certain analyses, to known Antarctic valleys that were identified by modern subglacial surveys conducted in the 20th century. Not where rivers are today. There are no rivers on Antarctica today, where rivers would have been when the continent was last ice-free. I tried to dismiss this detail. I'm not sure I entirely managed it. The Boache map of 1737 is the most striking case in this cluster. Philippe Boache was an 18th century French cartographer who produced a map of the Antarctic region based on, he said, earlier sources he had access to. His map shows Antarctica divided into two distinct landmasses separated by a wide channel, running across the interior of the continent. This is not how Antarctica appears on the surface. The ice sheet covers everything. The continent looks from above like a single unified mass. But subglacial topographic surveys, conducted in the mid-20th century using seismic sounding and later satellite-based radar, revealed that, beneath the ice, Antarctica is indeed divided. There is a subglacial basin, now called the Wilkes Basin, that separates the East Antarctic and West Antarctic landmasses. If the ice were removed, the continent would look something like what Boache drew in 1737. Boache could not have known this from observation. Neither could any European explorer of his period, or the periods his source maps came from. The subglacial topography of Antarctica was unknown until technology that did not exist until the 20th century was brought to bear on it. That should not be possible. The mainstream response is that the correspondence is coincidental, or that it reflects distortions in how modern researchers are reading and projecting the map, the same methodological concerns that apply to the Hapgood analysis. These responses are reasonable. I take them seriously. But in the case of the Boache map specifically, I find them harder to fully accept. Not because I know where Boache got his information, I don't, but because the specific detail that corresponds to known subglacial topography is unusual enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires a higher degree of confidence than I actually have. Coincidence may be the correct explanation. It would be a fairly remarkable one. Let me try to say something honest about where I land on all of this. I do not think the Piri Reis map proves that a technically advanced civilization existed before recorded history. The evidence for that conclusion is too thin, too dependent on contested interpretive choices, and too conveniently structured. Every gap in the evidence becomes further proof of the hypothesis itself. That is a pattern worth being cautious about. I also do not think the conventional account fully closes the question. What I keep coming back to is the cartographic record of the period more broadly. The 15th and 16th centuries produced an extraordinary flowering of geographical knowledge in Europe, knowledge assembled, in many cases, from sources that were themselves assembled from older sources, many of which no longer exist. The Library of Alexandria contained geographical texts that did not survive its destruction. Arab scholars of the medieval period had access to Greek and Persian sources that are now lost. The Ottoman archives from which Piri Reis drew his 20 source maps have not been fully catalogued. The chain of transmission that produced his 1513 map runs through a documentary history with significant gaps in it. This is not evidence of a lost civilization. I want to say that plainly. Gaps in the documentary record are not the same as evidence of something extraordinary, filling those gaps. But gaps are real. They exist, and they mean there is cartographic information embedded in maps like Piri Reis whose origin we genuinely cannot trace. That is a more modest claim than the popular version of this story makes. It also survives the criticism more intact. There is a version of historical research that is essentially forensic. You take an object, a map, a document, a structure, and you try to determine as precisely as possible what it shows when it was made, and what it tells you about the knowledge available to the people who made it. This kind of work is slow, unglamorous. It produces conclusions that are hedged and qualified and conditional. And then there is the other kind, the kind that takes the same object and asks, what is the most dramatic conclusion consistent with this evidence? The Piri Reis map has attracted both kinds of attention. Hapgood was genuinely interested in the forensic questions, even if his methodology had problems. Many of the people who have cited him since were primarily interested in the dramatic conclusion. I'm more interested in the forensic questions, not because drama is bad, but because the forensic questions are actually harder, and harder questions tend to be the more interesting ones. Why did Renaissance cartographers include southern continents with specific coastlines when no European had observed them? What sources did Piri Reis actually use, and where did those sources come from? What does the Boache subglacial correspondence mean, if it means anything at all? How much geographical knowledge was lost in the centuries between the ancient Greek geographers and the early modern cartographers who inherited their tradition imperfectly through intermediaries whose own records are missing? These questions do not have satisfying answers, and I find that I cannot quite let them go. The map in Istanbul is almost certainly not evidence of Atlantis. It may well be a speculative southern continent, elaborated with borrowed detail from sources that did not survive, drawn by a careful man who was working in good faith from material he could not fully verify. But it was drawn by someone who said he was using sources he did not invent. And the chain of transmission behind those sources disappears into archives that no longer exist. Libraries that were burned, sea charts that were never copied, knowledge that moved along trade routes that did not produce written records.